Yeah. I love me with a passion. That's facts, nigga, no asking. I don't need your brands or fashion. Just tell me if I'm what's happening. All your advertisements is whack. How you gonna tell me what it is I lack? I love thick girls, yeah, that's a fact. How you gonna tell me this baby fat? That's mental enslavement. I don't need a type of frustration. You can keep your validation. Nigga, fuck you and your corporation. Yeah, I know I'm special cause I got the glow. I don't need these brands trying to tell me so. No Tommy Valve, Capital Giorgio. I love myself, yeah, that's all I know. I ain't watching them magazines. I ain't here when they saying things. I ain't watching them TV screens. Yeah, they only want me that green. I ain't watching them magazines. I ain't here when they saying things. I ain't watching them TV screens. Yeah, they only want me that green. What they want from me, they want. What they want from me, they want. What they want from me, they want. They want from me, they want. What 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 they want from me, they want. I don't know what they want from me. They can see what they wanna see. I'ma be who I wanna be. I ain't giving no apologies, yeah. Wise words is so profound. Love the way that I am right now. I'm a king and I'ma hold the crown. Don't need nobody trying to hold me down. I'm fresh and I'm clean. I'm woken up from a daydream. Yeah, plenty people like to say things. Don't let that stop you do great things. No, I don't listen what they tell me. I can think for myself. Yo, you beautiful as you wanna be. You don't need nobody help. Nah, I ain't watching them magazines. I ain't here when they saying things. I ain't watching them TV screens. Yeah, they only want me that green. I ain't watching them magazines. I ain't here when they saying things. I ain't watching them TV screens. Yeah, they only want me that green. What they want from me, they want. What they want from me, they want. What they want from me, they want. They want from me, they want. What 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 they want from me, they want.
Changed the image. Now, he did say that the second image you had didn't have a source, which is always nice to have, but I don't know how many times I've seen pictures of viruses on websites without a source from the mainstream. I guess that's okay for them to do that. I was just kind of blown away by his criticism, because it was obvious to me that you were showing electron micrograph from a paper that says this is COVID-19, and on the right-hand side, this is an exosome, and it's you can't really tell the difference.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure that I referenced every single image in that presentation, and they were in the last 3 pages. The third page might have got cut off on the video, but I've been freely distributing PDFs of the slideshow, okay, which contain all the references. So if somehow I missed it, then I apologize. It was just an oversight on my part. But I knew that was really important to give references for all the images, especially because I thought, I don't want people to question it. But all I did was, save the image and then paste it into the PowerPoint. I didn't edit it in any other way.
I mean, it says a lot about what's happening. It's kind of the Empire Strikes Back. I was listening to an interview, I think, with a Swedish epidemiologist who's been very critical of the lockdown and of the epidemiological models. And apparently after he did a very well viewed, very heavily viewed YouTube, people sort of slightly misinterpreted what he'd said about his CV. And they interpreted it to say that he was a professor of epidemiology Rockefeller University,
yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But he actually hadn't said that. But, you know, probably he was a little bit ambiguous. And so instead of going after his ideas, they attacked, you know, what they saw as scientific fraud in his CV, which is
right. Well, this is a very telling sign, because if you don't have a rational argument based on, you know, the facts or ideas purported, then you use what's called ad hominem, right, which is attack the character. And I've definitely, you know, experienced that many times, and I don't respond because it's not substantive.
Yeah,
you know,
I agree that that's the best way to respond to those things, is to ignore it, because they're just stupid. Another example of that is those two emergency room doctors from, is it Kern County in California?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I've seen parts of that interview.
They've been going after those guys quite heavily, and again, it's kind of like, well, they're just like country hick doctors wanting to make some money, right? Like it's either like lies about what they were saying, like you know, they just made up numbers or something, or they go after them, you know, like how can somebody from Kern County in California argue with people from New York City, right? Like that's just like, if you live in New York City, you have a superiority over everybody, I guess.
Right. Well, that's always true, of course. But you know, it's funny because first of all, you're not making any money from speaking against the mainstream narrative on this.
You're likely to lose money.
You're likely to, right? Exactly. And but you know, like look at yourself, David. You're not an MD. You don't have a doctorate in virology or molecular biology, but you were able to spend the time and be thoughtful about it, and you use your brain to figure out these things, and you've done an incredible job. I mean, I've actually been to your website several times before I really knew who you were, and you know, it was evident that there was real scholarship there. So this, you know, false requirement that we have to be some kind of credentialed expert, I think is a big part of the problem, because if we give away our own power to reason and research and study to designated experts, then we're subjected to whatever their opinion is and however that affects us according to someone else's wishes.
I kind of think it's an advantage for me because I cannot stand on a pulpit and preach. Like if somebody has, you know, a PhD and an MD in like epidemiology and virology and stuff like that, they can stand up and say things without giving any references. They can just say, this is a deadly virus. It's going to kill a million Americans if we don't do something, and we're going to have to shut down the whole country. And they can get away with that. If I was to say that, it would be like, well, there's some nutcase in Canada, right? So if I don't have a reference for pretty much everything I say, then I will be attacked on that basis because I don't have the status. And I think that's a problem with status, because a lot of people with high status actually aren't as familiar with the literature as you'd like to imagine, and they certainly don't examine it critically.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, they just, you know, accept all these premises. I mean, if people were critical, they would look at these papers alleging to isolate a new virus, and they would say, this is ridiculous. It doesn't even follow the basic scientific method.
Yes. Well, let's move on to the RT-PCR test. And so we know that RT-PCR is looking for RNA. You know, they have some RNA they say is from a virus. This critic of you said, oh, it's easy for RT-PCR to distinguish viral RNA from cellular endogenous RNA. I mean, what's your thought on that?
Well, you know, the PCR is a very powerful technique, and it has led to some, you know, major advances in molecular biology, because you have this situation where you have just tiny amounts of genetic material that you couldn't possibly measure, and this technique allows you to amplify it so you can characterize it and examine what its role might be in, you know, in some experiment that you're looking at. And it's an excellent tool for that. But it comes with a very big downside that you have to confirm these things by other methods, because when you amplify something, you amplify the signal, but you also amplify the noise, right? And this is true for every type of amplification. If you go to your stereo and crank the volume way up, you're going to notice that you hear a hissing sound, right? And that's because you're also amplifying that noise. And so if a signal is absent, the noise can become the signal. And so that's the big downside of that technique. And the more you amplify it, the bigger the risk that you're going to interpret the noise as a signal.
Yeah, the RT-PCR uses fluorescence. So you're not actually measuring the amount of DNA, you're measuring the amount of light. And so if that fluorescence can be produced in some other way, like as you say, running at too many cycles, you start to get a light signal that is going to look exactly the same as a light signal from DNA. There's no difference. It's just fluorescence. You can't see the DNA.
And you know, when two strands of RNA or DNA come together, they don't always line up perfectly. Like sometimes it only takes a few base pairs to anneal them together, and that might not be the full sequence. Like there may be a stretch of 10 or 15 or even 20 base pairs that are the same, but then it's different. So like even if you took the probes and primers that they've designed for the test, and I actually had a researcher do this, and you compare them against all the sequences in the officially reported human genome, you see lots of overlap in terms of 15 or 20 base pair sequences, whereas the primer length is only 26 base pairs. So you have, a lot of overlap, and that's where you could get errors where a human sequence could be amplified and then create that fluorescent signal that you're talking about.
Right. Another thing I thought of just today this critic was actually quite useful because he said some things that made me think. So I have to give him credit for that. But he said, if you look for the DNA sequence of the primers in the BLAST database, you don't find it. And you're agreeing with that. You're saying that the full sequence is not there, but if you trim the sequence a little bit, you can actually find it. So what's close to that sequence is in human DNA. So this is where I was going with my earlier question, is if the RNA is not produced directly from DNA, and we know that that's the case, then you're not going to find RNA sequences in the BLAST database because they're DNA sequences. What you're looking at is the complementary RNA sequence. And if the RNA that's produced endogenously is not directly from your DNA, there's RNA in your body that is not going to be in the BLAST database, right?
Wow. David, that's a really good point. I can't believe I didn't think of that, but yeah, that's really good because there is processing of RNA strands after transcription, and so depending on if that occurs, before you look at the sequence, it could be different than the DNA sequence.
Yeah, if we had a BLAST database for RNA, then we could search that.